Hi, everyone. Very happy to see all of you here. And we were just talking about how some of us feel sleepy in the afternoons. But welcome to this discussion. And one thing that I read this book, just finished yesterday. And I'll say that from what I've read this year, it's my favorite. And I really thought of the concept of what it means to be a global citizen. So, how many of us here actually consider ourselves global citizens? Show of hands, anyone? Okay. If there's one person who has a claim to that, now Rochelle did a very good job explaining about his roots, and he's got, let's see, from his mother's side, Polish, Jew, and there's German as well that I gathered from the book, probably Romanian and Ukrainian. And of course, I would say New Zealander, English, and well, he's married to an Indian, and a Malayali, so I'll say he's part Keralite as well. But first thing I wanted to ask you was this concept of identity. How do you choose to identify as in this globalized world where people are trying to put labels on everyone?
Well, the tricky thing is whenever one is asked a question like, how do you identify yourself, you often agree with the premise of the question and comply. And you say, oh, I'm this or that. I often find myself questioning questions. That is one question in particular I get a bit nervous about. The idea of a global citizen, on the one hand, it seems sort of attractively cosmopolitan. A global citizen will feel at home anywhere. And the fact of the matter is, I don't feel at home everywhere. There's some places where I feel very comfortable. There's some places where I love to be. There's some places where I love to be where I feel increasingly uncomfortable. And there are certain trajectories I can take because of the languages I speak, because of how I've been educated, because of whom I'm involved with, but they don't leave me everywhere. So I think global citizen is a term I might resist, just as I might resist what seems to me the juggernaut of the demand that we self-identify. I think identity is often seen as a liberation, and it can be more often than not a trap. But to the extent that I identify with being Jewish, perhaps in the etymological sense of the word Hebrew, which I talk about in the book. Hebrew comes from, I only recently discovered, an ancient Egyptian word that means unrooted. And it didn't necessarily have a specifically ethnic connotation when it started. It meant simply those who cannot settle. So I think of myself as unsettled.
Yeah, I guess that's something I'm sure your mother had to feel because of all the travel that she had to do too. But we talk about the Jewish people, and when we think of the Silk Road, when we think of Fergana, we think of China, we think of Chinese, Indians, we think of people from different parts of Europe using that, and of course those in Central Asia. But what I discovered from this book was that there's a long Jewish heritage there, and they played a very important role in the development of the Silk Road. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So the Silk Road is a bit of a vexed term these days. I don't know if any of you have read William Dalrymple's The Golden Roads, in which he disputes the idea that there ever was a Silk Road. And I think partly what he's chafing at is the idea that a trade network dominated by China was sort of responsible for all Eurasian trade. And I share some of his suspicion, although I'm a little bit nervous by what I see as a sort of swapping of China as the dominant ancient global superpower for India as the truly global ancient superpower. India's cultural influence, or what we now call India, its cultural influence was extraordinary. But in some ways, the beating heart of the trade networks, and I'm deliberately using the plural, the trade networks that traversed from the Chinese Sea, through to the Bay of Bengal, the Arabian Sea, the inner lakes of the Caspian Sea, the Aral Sea, the Black Sea, all the way to the Mediterranean. The beating heart was in Central Asia. And it was right at the junction between three major spheres of influence: China, the Indic subcontinent, and Persia and the Persianate world. Now, Jews have been living in Central Asia for well over 2,000 years. Our modern imagination tends to root people. Say, it's a question that I often hear in India. Where do you belong? From where do you come? It's very difficult in my case to say where I come from. My two parents were born in different countries. My four grandparents were born in different countries. Their parents were born in different countries. And I think it's more accurate to talk about histories and cultures of unsettled people. Many of these were trader people. But the Jews of Central Asia, and there were certainly communities that were based there for long, long periods of time, but they felt a deep kinship with family members, clan members who came from elsewhere. And in fact, it took a long time to develop. But for about 1,500 years, there was an extensive network of Jewish traders spanning from Al-Andalus in Spain, all across Eurasia, North Africa, Eurasia, to Kaifeng in China. They were aware of each other, they communicated with each other, they conveyed goods from their parts of the world, and depended on the services of fellow Jews to convey them further. At various times, political interventions meant that some of these communities were cut off from each other. So the Kaifeng Jews, for instance, as a result of upheavals in the Tang dynasty in about the 11th century, became pretty much completely cut off from the rest of Jewry. And in Central Asia, there were a number of historical developments over time, including some of what Tony Joseph was speaking about actually in the last session. A reconfiguration of political power in the Kushan Empire, which led to the fall of the Kushan Empire. Reconfigurations in the Persian Empire from the Achaemenids through the Parthians and the Seleucids to the Sassanids. That meant the Central Asian Jews for various periods of time became somewhat cut off from the rest of Jewry. But there were also long chunks of time where they were very much in contact with Jewish communities from many parts of these trade networks. But this is what my mother came into contact with, just to fill you in. The book is partly a memoir of my mother, a Polish Jew who was deported in 1940 from Lvov to a labor camp in Siberia by the Soviets. And after the Polish government in exile threw their lot behind the Soviets in 1941, she and many other Polish Jews in camps were, quote, freed and deported again to Central Asia. And the thing that I find fascinating is that my mother and her family and many other Polish Jews were living pretty much side by side with the descendants of one of the most ancient Asian communities, Jewish communities, the Bukharan Jews, many of whom had migrated to the Fergana Valley. But she was only very dimly conscious of them. So this book is an attempt to understand the deep history that my mother blundered into and was to a certain extent unaware of. And this was the part that I discovered as I was doing the research for the book. That history had nonetheless shaped the history of my family long before they'd come to Central Asia. One of the claims of this book is that Jewishness, far from being something that emerged organically and fully formed out of the soil of ancient Israel or Egypt, developed historically through a period of negotiation, conversation, and codification in Asia, especially in Babylon and under the Achaemenids in Persia. Pretty much any Jew living today, whether they're Sephardic or whether they're Ashkenazi or whether they're Mizrahi, can trace their history culturally, if not genealogically, in Asia, Central Asia, 2,000 years ago. And this is one of the things that struck me more and more as I was trying to tell my mother's story. You cannot simply tell the story of an individual. An individual's story always involves the ghosts that for thousands of years have been playing a shaping role in making them who they are. And so Central Asia becomes sort of one of the key players in this book in understanding the history of Jewishness as well as the history of my mother.
Right. So you spoke about the ghosts of the past, and you traveled to these places quite a few times from what I gathered in this book. And knowing the history of how it affected your mother from what you found in the chest, and how difficult was that to go to those places and to know that as a child that she went through the kind of things that she did?
It was, to use a word that I seem to be using a lot right now, deeply unsettling. So just to fill you in, when I was growing up, my parents were refugee parents. We had very little by way of family. In fact, I had no family growing up. We had very little by way of heirlooms. So next to no furniture, save for one object, the Chinese tea chest that is on the cover of this book, which I was absolutely fascinated by because, number one, it was the only piece of furniture in the family living room. But number two, it was extraordinarily beautiful. It was a teak and camphor chest that had been carved probably in Shanghai in the late 19th century. And I knew that it was crammed full of items from my mother's past. And I became fascinated by what those contents might be, precisely because my mother didn't allow me or my two sisters ever to open it. All the contents of the chest were buried deep in straw and naphtha. I used to crack open the chest, but the smell of the naphtha was so strong that my mother would immediately appear in the living room to slam the chest shut because she could smell it. So my curiosity only grew. And so my mother, I knew, had had a very difficult past because we didn't have any family members. I remember asking her when I was young, "Where's your mother?" "Oh, she's not here." "Where's your father?" "He's not here." "Do we have any relatives?" All my friends at school had uncles and aunts and cousins, and they're not here. But when she opened up about her experiences during the war, she would tell me a story about having gone to Russia, not to Central Asia, to Russia. And she narrated her time in Russia as the best years of her life. Even I, as a child, sensed that there was something perhaps a little, shall we say, fabricated about this narrative. But to a certain extent, there was a germ of truth in it. Even in a labor camp in Siberia, my mother experienced a certain kind of freedom that she hadn't had in a very tightly constrained bourgeois Jewish household in Warsaw prior to the war. She was able to go hunting for berries in the forest with her best friend. She was able to do things that she simply hadn't been able to do in Warsaw. What I hadn't known was the Central Asian component of her story. I'd known that she had spent part of the war in a place called Uzgen, but she always told me that she'd been in Russia. Uzgen was a village in Russia, a very primitive village in Russia. And it was only in 1988, my mother and I went to the Soviet Union. And she was at that point determined to get back to Uzgen, and she wanted to take me. But we couldn't go to Uzgen because Uzgen, it turned out, was a part of the Soviet Union that was off limits to tourists. And I only found out then that it was in the Kyrgyz Republic, so not Russia at all. The closest we could get was an Aeroflot package tour to the Uzbek Republic. So we spent some time in Tashkent and Samarkand. But my mother felt very disappointed by all this because although we went to the Tashkent Bazaar and I could see her eyes flicker open with interest. And she said, this is a little bit like what Uzgen was. She felt that she hadn't accessed the past that she wanted to see. But my curiosity was even more awakened by this, especially by one incident. Outside the Tashkent Bazaar, this was 1988, it was a very hot summer's day in August. It was about 40 degrees, certainly hotter than a boy from New Zealand had ever experienced. And a drunken Uzbek man came up to my mother, who was still only about, at that point, 55 or so, and she was a very striking woman. And he approached her in what was a fairly lascivious way. And my mother suddenly unleashed a volley of swear words in a language I'd never ever heard her speak. And the Uzbek guy put up his hands in the air saying, "You got me," and walked away. And I turned to my mother and I said, "What was that?" And she said, "Oh, I didn't know I remembered all that." And it turned out these were swear words she had learned in the Uzgen Bazaar as a child who had been forced to live in a mud hut for 5 years. She lost her father within a couple of days of arriving. She lost her mother 2 years later. Her sister and her were orphaned. And they survived in large part because they'd go to the bazaar and barter items, small items like needles and thread, in return for flour, which the Uzbeks called, although it was in the Kyrgyz Republic, it was an Uzbek enclave. There were also Tajiks, Kyrgyz, Kazakhs, Koreans, as well as Polish Jews, Polish Christians and Russians living there. But the Uzbeks called the flour, or rather the bread made out of flour, non. Okay? So my mother told me, we survived on non for 5 years by adding just a little bit of water to the flour. So at the time I thought, wow, this makes my mother even more exotic than I thought. It was only after I moved to India and two things had happened. I'd moved to India, I'd learned Hindi and Urdu. My mother had also begun to succumb to Alzheimer's. And Alzheimer's is one of the cruelest diseases imaginable. It drilled through the layers of her memory, step by step. My mother could speak 8 or 9 languages, but she began to forget languages in the reverse order that she'd learned them. And the first language to go was English. Now, my first language wasn't English, it was Polish. My second language was Hebrew. My third language was English. But I never I never acquired much proficiency in either Polish or Hebrew, because at an early age, my parents decided because we were living in New Zealand, it would be best for my development if I grew up just speaking English. So once my mother had forgotten English, it was very, very hard. She chatted to me in Polish and Hebrew. I'd understand, but I couldn't really talk with her. And I could see not only her receding, but my connection to her receding. But every now and then, on some days, she'd speak to me in Uzbek. And unlike in 1987, 1988, when it was a completely foreign language to me, I discovered, much to my surprise, I could understand a lot of things that she was saying in Uzbek. So not only naan, the word for meat, gusht, for spice, murch. Anyone who speaks Hindi or Urdu can work out. Carrots, for some reason, were sabzi. But other terms, cemetery, where her mother was buried, kabristan. Catastrophe, qayamat. And then the one that killed me, mohabbat. So I had to migrate to India to acquire the language that would allow me to connect in mohabbat, in love, to my mother who'd forgotten the language in which she had brought me up with love. So I felt this story needed to be written. That this wasn't just about a Hindi speaker, a new Hindi speaker encountering an Uzbek speaker. This was also a story of migration, not only of people, but also of languages. That Persian terms had migrated through the hubs of the Silk Road, through Central Asia, down through the Kushan Empire, into what is now northern India. And so this is a book not just about my mother, it's also about all of us in this room. And thinking in ways that unsettle us, that get us out of the habit of saying, from where do you come? Where do you belong? What is your place? Your place might have histories that are way more surprising and way more unsettling than you think.
Also, you've mentioned about the joy she felt at individual moments, about her Uzbek friend, the one she remembered, but you couldn't find out more about her. And also about the joy she felt when she was practicing for the ballet, the mazurka. And, there's so much of that. So I just don't want anyone to think that it's only about trauma and difficulty. One thing you must have noticed here at this festival, there are a lot of people from northeastern India. And a discovery for me, was about two things. One about Manas in Kyrgyzstan, that story, and about the Mizo people who believe they're among the lost tribes. Can you tell us a little bit more about this connection that spreads all the way across India?
So some of you may know that in Mizoram and Manipur, there are many people who have started to identify as Jewish, and they call themselves the B'nai Menashe. Christian missionaries had come in, mostly British Christian missionaries had come into the Northeast in the 19th century, and had found much to their surprise that there was a willing audience, people willing to convert to Christianity. What became apparent over time was that the stories that most spoke to some people were not from the New Testament, but the Old. Because some of these stories actually resonated quite profoundly with local traditions and local stories. So the B'nai Menashe are often spoken about as a group that converted to Judaism, which is to a certain extent true. But what is interesting is amongst their traditions is an origin story that involves a hero figure named Manmasi, whose name is pronounced Manasi. And Manasi has led his followers across a sea that has suddenly parted. Manasi has led his followers across desert, across mountains. And according to these people, they came through what is now China from Tibetan regions and Afghanistan. Right? Now, the Kyrgyz have what is now called their national epic. I'm very suspicious of the word national here, but it's called the Manas Dastani. It's a very interesting title, because Dastani is, of course, a Persian term, and the Kyrgyz are technically a Turkic people. Right? But the story of Manas, that's what Manas Dastani means. The story of Manas is about a sheep farmer who is the son of someone named Yaqub. Okay? And Yaqub has a bunch of sons who leave their native land and go far, far away. And Manas, amongst other things, acquires a magical coat. If you're familiar with the story of Joseph, and the coat, the story seems incredibly familiar. And it seems like there is a direct connection between the now Bnei Menashe of Mizoram and Manipur and the Kyrgyz and their stories of Manas. And in turn, there is a connection with Jewish stories, or more accurately, Israelite stories. Now, I am not making some crazy claim that the Bnei Menashe are genealogically descended from Israelites. The Bnei Menashe make that claim, and that's fine. That's part of their oral tradition. Actually, what I'm more interested in is not whether or not the Bnei Menashe or the Kyrgyz are genealogically the descendants of Israelites. What I'm interested in is how stories migrate. And I think this is part of the extraordinary legacy of the trade networks that Tony Joseph was glancing at tantalizingly in his amazing presentation. It's not just people that migrate. As traders move across this vast terrain, they move at a very slow pace. So the people of the Kushana Empire called the traders Sartavaha. They traveled in caravans, often with camels, at a very slow pace. And they would stop off at night in what the Persians called sarais, where they would eat and they would exchange stories. Now, many of the people in the Sartavahas were Jewish traders, Persian-speaking Jewish traders, coming from centers like Babylon from the time of the Achaemenids through to the Sassanids, Ctesiphon, which was sort of the new Babylon just south down the Euphrates River, and later Baghdad. People from other traditions, Turkic traditions, brought stories with them. And people would exchange stories, swap stories. We have been so conditioned into boxing cultural phenomena in national terms that we have often found it difficult to recognize that genealogy doesn't point back in one direction, the origin of a nation, but fans out in many, many directions. And the history of the Silk Roads and literature on the Silk Roads makes this abundantly clear. So take the Panchatantra, for instance, which we think of as quintessentially Indian. Many of its tales, even though it's being claimed for Hindu tradition, many of its tales come from Buddhist Jataka tradition. These tales migrated across the early trade routes into Persia, where they were incorporated into Zoroastrian stories and were assimilated into a corpus called the Hazar Destan. Right? Hazar Dastan, 1,000 stories. You can guess where this is headed. The Hazar Destan migrated to the caravanserais in Baghdad, and over time had not just Zoroastrian and Muslim, but also Taoist and Jewish stories added to them. Some of the stories of the 1001 Nights include stories like the Pious Israelite, which actually is based on a Roman story called the Menaechmi, that later got turned into a play by Plautus that influenced Shakespeare, which became his Comedy of Errors, which in turn migrated to Bengal with the British, influenced the Bengali Renaissance and became Bronte Bilash, Vidyasagar's story, which in turn influenced a filmmaker, Manu Sen, who made a film called Bronte Bilash, which influenced Gulzar, who made Angur, the film. Okay? So, Har Dastan Avara hai. Because people talk to each other. And along the Silk Roads, in these sarais, people exchanged stories to pass the time. They also exchanged ideas about the world. In Babylon, for instance, where what came to be Judaism was codified in the rabbinical academies, descendants of the Israelites spoke with Zoroastrians. And much of what we now think of as quintessentially Jewish was a result of conversation with Zoroastrianism. So there was no heaven and hell in the early Israelite cosmology. There was no Moshiach, Messiah. That all came because of conversations with Zoroastrians. Orthodox Jews bury their fingernails after they've clipped them. That's a Zoroastrian tradition. So part of what this book is trying to do is disrupt the idea that identity is ever singular. Identity is the product of conversation. Identity is the product of unsettling, not just settling. And I felt this was a very important story to tell to better understand my mother, who was an enormously complicated person, but also to unsettle some of the stories that have a stranglehold around us now and that are, I think, responsible for some of the worst violence in the world at this point, because we want to safeguard myths of singular origin against the possibility that, in fact, our identities have always been impure and the product of conversations with others.
Yeah, that's something I also enjoyed reading about King Nebuchadnezzar, and because as somebody who went to a Baptist Christian school in New York, my idea of Judaism in Israel was completely in contradiction to this. But we speak about commonalities. What I wanted to ask you was, I read in the book about how Sovietsky Soyuz, Soviet Union, Kyrgyzia, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, they did all this. So the Fergana Valley was essentially divided. What I wanted to ask you about was the concept of the modern nation state. How much damage has it done to humanity when we think about this?
Well, I think the modern ethno-national state has done the most damage. So ethno-nationalism is the villain in this book. To a certain extent, the hero of this book is the Fergana Valley. And Fergana is a term that resonates for many people in India because they associate it, I presume, with most of you here know that Babur, the first Mughal emperor, was born in the Fergana Valley. The Fergana Valley is an extraordinary place geographically. It's a thin strip, green strip of land. It's not exactly a valley. It's more like a sort of slightly depressed plateau between several mountain ranges. It takes up 0.2% of Central Asia's landmass, but 20% of Central Asia's population is there because it's an extraordinarily fertile area. It's also, as I intimated, right at the junction of these elaborate trade routes between the east, the west, and the south. As a result, the Fergana Valley is also arguably the most ethnically diverse part of the planet. They're people descended from Chinese, people descended from Indic subcontinent, from Persia, from Europe, many other places. It wasn't just in the time of my mother. At the bazaar in Uzgen, I mentioned she could hear Uzbek, Tajik, Kyrgyz, Kazakh, Korean, Russian, Polish. Even when the Chinese monk Xuanzang, who came to India in the 7th century looking for Buddhist scripture, he took a merchant caravan from Kaifeng through to what he called Ferhan, the Fergana Valley. And he was absolutely shocked by it. In China, he'd seen nothing quite like it because he had grown up in a somewhat ethnically homogeneous society. He was astonished by how diverse Fergana was. And at the time he came, there were ethnic Greeks, Tibetans, Chinese, Turks, Kushans, Persians living there. But there were the Fergana Valley is this tiny strip. It's about 200 kilometers long, but only ever about 20 kilometers wide. It had never been a nation state. And that was something that Xuanzang also pointed out. This place isn't ruled by anyone. He said, that's kind of weird. And it was fought over by various warlords, but its extraordinary diversity and the Bazari conversation that characterized it continued to unfold over basically 2,000 years. The Soviets, hoping to instill an ethos of communism in what it regarded as its primitive Turkic, the primitive Turkic colonies that Russia had conquered. Although Marxism itself is fiercely opposed to the idea of the nation state and nationalism, Lenin employed a young former Georgian priest who had been a Georgian nationalist but had warily come around to the Russian communist cause, to devise a plan for the Turkic territories, including the Fergana Valley. This man came to be known as Stalin. And Stalin, as the commissar of the People's Republics, presided over a plan that willy-nilly, in a fashion that should be familiar to everyone who lives in the Indian subcontinent, divided up the Fergana Valley on the basis that there are three major ethnicities living there, and there's a small problem. They all live side by side. But we've got to work out which is the native territory of the Kyrgyz, which is the native territory of the Uzbeks, and which the native territory of the Tajiks. And completely random borders were drawn. Uzgen, which was a mixed town, but Uzbek majority, ended up in Kyrgyzstan. Bukhara, which was Tajik majority, ended up not in Tajikistan, but in Uzbekistan. It was a mess in a way that we're all familiar with here. Now, I'm not going to say Fergana Valley was a paradise. There were many things that happened there that were hideous over time. But what we never saw was communal violence, ever, until the 1990s, after the Soviets left. Familiar, isn't it? After the British left, after the Soviets left the Fergana Valley, having given them the gift of the nation state, all of a sudden, Uzbeks started mowing down Meshkitian Turks. Tajiks started shooting at Kyrgyz. Kyrgyz went after Uzbeks. And what we've seen unfold in the Fergana Valley is uncannily familiar to us here in the subcontinent. I'd say it's part of a larger history. If we see the history of partition as simply an Indian and Pakistani story, I think we're missing out on an extra layer that is really important for understanding what is in fact a global phenomenon in the aftermath of colonialism and imperialism. The most toxic export that Europe has given the world is the ethnic nation state. It's not something that was confined to Nazism. We find many instances of it still, and often being sold as the path to liberation, as the path to decolonization. That if we surround ourselves with fellow people who belong to our tribe within a bounded nation state, then we'll be free. The dark underbelly of this, of course, is then we need enemies who have to be, over time, targeted and expelled. And we're seeing the consequences of that in many parts of the world right now.
Right. Well, it's not just with ethnic nation states, right? Even those that are multi-ethnic, they need that enemy. But before I throw the floor open to questions, you wanted to read a small passage from the book, right? Would you like to do that?
Sure. This is, in fact, a couple of passages thrown together in Jugaad fashion, just to give you a bit of a flavor about my mother and how the book came into being.
Some of us have the book, so you'll have to tell us the page number.
So starting on page 8. This is after what happened after my mother began to succumb to Alzheimer's. My mother's Alzheimer's had advanced to an alarming degree. As her memory crumbled, her younger cells started to make themselves heard. She had begun to forget English, the last of the many languages she learned, and would often chatter with me in the Polish of her childhood and the Hebrew of her teens, even though I speak little of either. Sigmund Freud once compared memory to Rome, serially built atop earlier versions of itself. He believed the psychoanalyst, like an archaeologist, could dig to retrieve ancient layers of experience buried deep in the city of memory. Perhaps that's why my mother always resisted psychoanalysis. Freud was a big part of her family lore, as he was supposed to be a relative on her father's side. Her name was Stella Freud. But there were old experiences she didn't want to have memories of, couldn't have memories of. Now traces of those experiences had begun to speak through her without the help of a psychoanalyst. Alzheimer's, like psychoanalysis, digs deep into the city of memory. But it takes to it like an urban developer's pneumatic drill, unearthing the buried layers of one's past while destroying everything else en route. I mourned the loss of the mother who had known me in English. Yet I was fascinated by the fragments of lost past that were now surfacing in other languages, exposed by the mental wrecking ball of her condition. I longed to piece together these fragments, to access the larger life worlds that I could glimpse through them. As her memory cracked and splintered, fragments of another language, like shards of Roman columns, mosaics, and amphoras unearthed by modern bulldozers, also came to light. The language was Uzbek. I'll just stop there.
Okay. Does anybody have questions? Or do we have time, Rochelle? That wasn't 10 minutes, right? Okay, great. You'll have to teach me some of those Uzbek cuss words. I may be able to use them at Chorsu, where your mother was accosted.
I've just got to tell you, most of the Uzbek cuss words that my mother used were Turkic, but there were some Persian cuss words as well that haven't quite moved into Hindi or Urdu. But one of them is it's my absolute favorite, bulbulcha. It means a little nightingale, and it means someone with a very small penis. I love this idea. That the nightingale singing its sad song at night. Now we know why. This is what my mother unleashed on that guy, no wonder.
Oh my God.
Guilty as charged.
I wouldn't try that at Chorsu, I may get murdered.
One more thing I want to say while people think about questions. The title, The Girl from Fergana, I don't want to give too many spoilers. I said before, what I'm trying to do with this book is make us realize that what we think of as having a single identity is always plural, is always the result of conversation, is always more than one. So people might think at first that the girl from Fergana is my mother. And they're right, it is my mother. But there's another girl in this book who is the girl from Fergana too. And that was my mother's neighbor My mother lived in a mud hut for 5 years. Her landlord was an Uzbek man who had a daughter who was about 6 months younger than my mother. They became best friends, and my mother learned Uzbek from her. I never found out about this girl until my mother began to come down with Alzheimer's, and for the first time she told me about Kamalakaran, her best friend. And I was just shocked. She'd never mentioned this. And I asked her about Kamalakaran. She couldn't remember a lot of things about her. What she remembered most of all was the smell of her clothes in winter, because my mother's mother had just died, and Kamalakaran was the one who would hug her close in the cold of the winter in the mud hut. So this title is about a conversation between a Jewish girl and a Muslim girl, who are both the girl from Fergana. And I just want to tell you that to give you an indication of what this book is about, that what one considers most intimately the self is in fact part of a conversation that we may have forgotten, whether it's because of Alzheimer's or because of political brainwashing.
Right. Somebody had a question? Yeah. Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm.
Yep. Art Shalva. Shalva, yes?
No, Karina.
Oh, okay, Karina. Okay,
I don't
yep,
think I've
sorry.
met you yet, but I'm very much looking forward to buying your book and reading it. The title itself fascinated me, and the talk itself is like, it's almost like a Tetris puzzle in my head now that I'm going to try and piece together. I mean, I could go in so many different directions and dominate the Q&A. Alzheimer's speaks very closely to me. My mother-in-law passed from it, and that whole experience, I'm convinced my son got into the university he did because he wrote this bewitching essay that started with the phrase, "I was the first one she forgot." And it was because he was the youngest grandchild. So I very much relate to this concept of, reverse, this loss in reverse. But the one piece that fascinated me was this conversation about the stories and the 1001 stories. And it brought back to me this book that I'd bought for my children when they were young about mythology. And it was fascinating to see so many stories from the Old Testament be like almost, origin stories from other parts of the world. And it unlocked for us as a family this exactly the conversation you had, which I thought was fascinating. So I'm really looking forward to your book and all the stories it's going to unlock for me and my family as a result. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me just say one thing quickly in response to that. So the title of 1001 Nights in Arabic is Alf Layla va Layla, 1001 Nights. It means the same thing in Hebrew. Alf Layla va Layla means the same thing in Hebrew. And I think it's important to remember Jews and Arabs have been speaking for a very long time in related languages. And unfortunately, the partitions of the last century have resulted in the production of so-called timeless enmities and the forgetting of conversations and shared stories that have bound us for much, much longer.
A book like this, I think, will help rebuild those conversations. When you need to know how we were linked. We all need to know that. Any other questions? Okay, just take an opportunity to ask you one more.
Sure.
It wasn't obviously easy because your grandparents' generation, they could speak 7, 8 languages with ease, right? So when you had to research this, you did remember Polish, the Polish that you used with your mom as a child. But how, what were the other challenges besides the linguistic barriers, not just from the documents in the chest, but from the travel?
Yep. Access was a problem because some areas, thanks to the communal tension, for instance, in the Fergana Valley, it at various times has been very difficult to get there. Also, this was a more interesting problem. I found no end of people who wanted to educate me about the history of the region. And I was very interested in what they had to say because they live there. But it was apparent how much history had sort of reshaped their narrations of what was true. So I met a Bukhari Jew in America. And he had been born in Bukhara but had lived in America most of his life. The story he wanted to tell me was one of absolute trauma. How impossible it was to be a Jew living in Central Asia. Now there's an element of truth about that if one is speaking, say, about post-1992. Right? But if one goes back, one finds that the history that he was convinced had always been true simply wasn't. Number one, I went to the synagogue in Bukhara. It's called not a synagogue, but a masjid. Right? Right? I found Sufi poets, Jewish Sufi poets, in Central Asia. Right? So history had been colonized by certain, shall we say, political imperatives. And I would then find other people who tell completely different stories that were at total odds with what people had said to me was the God-honest truth about their experience as a Central Asian Jew. So trying to sift through all these competing narratives and work out what is historically accurate and what had been sort of stroked by the machinery of imperialism. Here's one last example, because I know time is up. I went to the synagogue in Samarkand, and I met the local leader of the Jewish community there, a lovely man named Yusuf. And he was rather surprised because he spoke Tajik, which is a Persian language. He was rather surprised when I spoke a bit of Persian to him. And he said, he asked me first not, why do you speak Persian? He said, you are Jewish? And I said, yes. He said, you must be Ashkenazi Jew. And I said, yes. He said, Khayli khub ast. How wonderful. He said, Ashkenazi Jew civilized. Samarkandi Jew, very primitive. And I looked at him in surprise and said, no. But that was part of the Soviet story that had come to him. That we in Central Asia are primitive. The Ashkenazis, by contrast, have tasted the progression. They've tasted Western civilization. So I had to sift through all of this, and part of this book is about how do we tell a historical story when so many layers of historical violence have shaped the archive of memory. Thanks very much. I know it's time for another.
Yeah, unfortunately we're out of time, but Mamnoon, Aga, Jonathan.